Today is Wednesday, December 25th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again, yes, that's right, on Christmas with Wallace G. Smith. The office is open, and we are here.
That's right. We are here working because the Living Church of God does not take Christmas as a holiday. I'm in my civvies, which does feel weird that I'm not wearing a suit and I'm here in the office because we are literally right after recording this podcast about to hit the road heading to the Kansas City weekend.
Nice.
So if anyone is there in Kansas City or thereabouts or headed to the Kansas City weekend, very excited about seeing you. We'll pray for a safe trip for you. Please pray for a safe trip for us. I'm looking forward to conducting the Bible study Friday night and then, God willing, the sermon the next day. And just excited about all the stuff there that you guys. In fact, Mr. Mark Sandor and his wife will be there. We'll be, anyway, very, very much looking forward to everything.
Awesome. So it sounds like you'll be busy.
I will be busy. Then we'll be back here early next week. So we are here on December 25th, which means if we're recording this today, you're probably going to hear this podcast after this day has passed. And yet, we still, honestly, since when have Mr. Robinson and I worried about being timely? This will be a little bit late to a certain extent, but we kind of thought, because of the day, that we would talk about handling Christmas-related questions. Some of you out there have probably heard some, whether it's school or work or friends, and maybe they've piled up well, now maybe we can talk about how you could have answered them or should have answered them. You've already answered them. Or maybe it's about gearing up for next year, but we thought, let's talk about answering Christmas queries. Thank you, Jake and Julia. And thank you also for not playing, even though I always pretend you're live when you're not. Thank you for not playing a Christmas jingle. I don't know how bad it's been for you, Mr. Robinson, going into stores and stuff like that. Or my Starbucks time has been a little more painful.
Oh, no, I can see that. Well, all I remember is walking into, I think, a grocery store the day after Halloween, and the Christmas music was all on.
Already?
Yeah. And I remember a guy, and nobody, generally, I just not talk to people in the grocery store. He comes by me and he's ranting and raving about how there's already Christmas music going on. So I noted it like right up front, but after that, I don't know. I just tune it out. I know we had a question a year or two ago when people asked how you cope with various Christmas issues, and one of them was, well, what about the Christmas music? And it was relatively easy for me to tune it out. Then we find out, I think later, that they worked in a mall or something. Like, it was inescapable.
That would be very difficult.
I think after a couple of weeks it would be.
Yeah, I don't know. This is my theory that I'm particularly sensitive because I think I've mentioned this before, but my mother didn't know any any kind of, what do you call them? But when you sing your child to sleep, I can't think of the word for that. Lullabies. My mom didn't know any lullabies.
It was all
she knew were Christmas music. So she would sing me to sleep using like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and things like that.
Give credit to a member of our editorial department who humorously co-opted one of the Christmas songs. So one of the benefits of coming into the office on December 25th is that it's the most wonderful drive of the year.
I thought that was very nice. It was. I'm not kidding. It took me almost 10 minutes less to get to work
incredible.
Today. It was. So it is the most wonderful drive of the year. That's we'll credit Mr. Williams with that. That was pretty witty. Before we get into the topic, you might think we're just going to ramble all for the whole podcast. That is possible. That's on the table. However, I do want to bring up Mr. Weston has asked us to consider about how to point our podcast more toward the world. That is, we would like to reach young millennials, Gen Zers in the world, and he's asked us to investigate that. We're working with Mr. DeSimone on doing that, but one thing we would like to do is to ask you, our listeners, directly for help. A lot of you do send emails, and we appreciate that. We appreciate your emails, your feedback, your questions. It really has powered, honestly, a lot of the podcast. But we'd like to more formally put together a group of some of you as volunteers where we can actually send you questions. We can send you maybe sample. We don't even know yet what to do, but send you sample podcasts, kind of query you, because we do want, as a church, we're all a part of this together. We want to reach more of the world, and we want to reach audiences that we're not currently reaching with the gospel. And so we would like to put together a team of volunteers, feedback volunteers, if you will, for how to reach millennials, Gen Zers, so that some people that can respond to questions. So I've set up a super short form. I have to admit, this is my first time using Microsoft Forms, I think it is.
Feels like it should be called Formly.
I can see that. I've used Google Forms before for other things, but we've set up a Microsoft form. And if you are willing to be a volunteer for us to run ideas by, to get to not just get feedback from passively, but to actively cultivate feedback going forward. I don't even know exactly what we would ask you, but we got to start somewhere. As we're trying to reach young millennials, Gen Zers, please go out to livingyouth.org. And it should be pinned up at the top. I think I've tried to make the post stand up there at the top, and there should be just read a little bit there, but there should be a form for you to fill out. It doesn't ask you any hard questions you don't know. What's your name? What's your birthday? What church area you go to? Who's your pastor? So please, if you're willing to be a volunteer, go out there, fill out the form. And as I understand it, through the magic of internets, it will assemble a list for us as each of you fill out the form, and then maybe you'll hear from us in the next 5 years, but hopefully you will hear from us, and we'll be able to start talking to you about getting some feedback. Mr. DeSimone has kind of exemplified that for us. If you see a lot of improvements in terms of what we're doing online with our advertisements or anything, that's because Mr. DeSimone is very good about trying to talk to people and see what their experience is like.
He's really highlighted to me personally. I know you as well, but we have all these great ideas we sure are going to work, or great hypotheses that we sure are true.
Yep.
And then there are mechanisms to test some of those hypotheses and theories, and more often than not, you find out that it's not. It's not what you think it's going to be.
But if you've just done a little bit of spade work early on, doing a little digging, talking to people, you actually might have discovered that was a bad idea before you started.
Yeah.
So in fact, it's not. We're not going to be insulted if, while we are beginning our talk about responding concerning Christmas things, if right now on your phone or whatever you have, you go out to livingyouth.org and you fill out that and you hit that form. It's not going to take very long. Honestly, I won't. Now, if you did it while I was giving a sermon and you were out in the audience, I think I'd be a little irritated. But it's not. You're just listening to a podcast. Go out, by all means, go out there and fill that out. And thank you very much for being willing to do so. Okay. As we mentioned earlier today, actually the world calls today Christmas because it's a day they've set aside for, Christmas. They like to say it's the day Jesus was born, even though some of them know it's not. They don't really care. And I say today as we're recording this. I don't know when you're going to listen to it. I might be able to get it up actually today, a little bit early, Mr. Robinson. We're going to be on the road, but I still tend to work on the road. When I'm driving, I still tend to work on the road. So I might even get it up today, but otherwise you might be listening to it later this week. But each year we get questions here and there. At least I definitely used to, especially when I wasn't working. No, let me say this. No one here in the office has asked me why I don't keep Christmas, Mr. Robinson. Apparently it's not a mystery.
There's so many positives to working for the church.
Oh boy, that's definitely one of them. But out in the world, or even in school and college and such, definitely used to get questions about that.
Oh yeah.
And I don't know if you have any particular personal experiences. I thought starting off we would talk about any if you have them. I had one that actually caught me off guard several of these caught me off guard, but when I first began working, I was making a good friend. In fact, I would say he actually looks kind of like you, Mr. Robinson. If I ever showed you his picture, you'd probably completely disagree. He was not as tall as you.
I have found it's very risky to tell somebody you found somebody you think looks like them, because if they think that person is not attractive or something, then they're offended.
Well, I was told once I look like John Cryer. John Cryer, so I'm thinking of. But you would look at him now as an adult, you wouldn't think that. He's even played, I think, Lex Luthor in something on TV. However, back when he was a teenager and I was a teenager, we actually did look remarkably alike. But now I'm an older man, and so I've been told I look like a younger Don Rickles. Who's a not handsome comedian. And regrettably, I've found that to be true. Regardless, I've got off track. My friend kind of find out he was Catholic. I don't know if I knew that at the time, and I don't think he took his Catholicism that seriously, but as at least part of his culture, he did. And I think he was asking me about why we don't keep Christmas, and I mentioned, Christmas is pagan. It's got pagan. I said something like that, a little too brusquely, a little too quickly, and he I could tell he was a little bothered by that, and he just said, "Well, what's pagan? What does that mean?" And I got to admit, I never thought about that before. I'd never actually been asked what does the word pagan actually mean, and I thought bad. I mean, I knew I had a sense of what it meant, but I've actually never put it into words before.
It does. Like I found in both when I used it and just in general usage, especially by church members, it's just kind of like a vague term that means bad.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's not that specific.
No, it's really not. And so I don't know if you've ever had any kind of experiences.
Well, I had one. So again, this is one of those times you and I have different experiences when we were younger, which was I grew up in the church, so naturally I did not ever keep Christmas.
Right.
But it does not take you long when you grow up that way, especially I found. I say especially, I don't know that it would be any different, but it felt like my experience living. Well, I've learned if you say you're in Texas, that's not considered part of the South, but you get the idea. Very conservative area. You realize real quick you are the only one that doesn't keep Christmas.
And everybody around you does.
And everybody keeps Sunday and you don't. And so like I think like a lot of kids would, I didn't like feeling different. So man, I tried to dodge it as best I could. But I remember one time, I'm pretty sure it was 4th grade, there was a boy that was a friend of mine, and he was Jewish. And I didn't, man, I'm surprised how little I knew about the lay of the land with religions and fully what they believed in. All I knew about the Jews was they kept Sabbath, which seemed pretty cool to me because nobody else kept the Sabbath.
Right.
And so then it was easy for me to fall into the trap, and this really is a trap. If there's younger listeners who've also don't know the differences very well, it's all too easy but inaccurate to say, well, we're like the Jews except that we believe in Christ.
Oh, tempting. Yep. So tempting to say that.
Yeah. And while there are some similarities, kind of, there's a lot of differences beyond just that. But somebody that kept the Sabbath and knew. So anyway, I kind of imply that I'm Jewish. I'm not trying to say that I'm Jewish, but it's sort of just like, and then it starts to build and become a life of its own, and then he's convinced I'm Jewish, and I didn't actually ever say I really was Jewish, at least as I can remember. But it gets worse and worse, and then when he starts asking me what toys I got for Hanukkah and this whole thing, and then he began to become suspicious of me. I was not actually Jewish, and I don't even know how to work my way out of this conundrum because it was not an intent to deceive, not really, but I was okay with him thinking I was Jewish because then I didn't have so many questions, because you are the weirdo that doesn't keep Christmas like everybody else unless you're Jewish, and then that's like, oh well, he's Jewish is the kind of idea.
That's fascinating. Yeah, definitely did not have that problem. Well, because I was busy keeping Christmas growing up. That's the thing that was different for me, was having to face people who recognize you used to keep it, and then all of a sudden now you don't. And so it's hard to come across like a judgment on them.
That would be hard, because once you get, for me, we moved around a lot. So like every new school, like from 1st grade to 6th grade, we were in a different school every year until we finally settled down in Tyler. But then people start to know that you don't keep Christmas over time, and so then it doesn't come up as much.
Right.
And then also you had to go, school year's barely started, and you're going and talking to your teacher about how you're going to be gone for 10 days to the feast, and I'm supposed to get the homework, and that was not very much fun, and all this kind of stuff. So
I didn't think about that, because my first time to do that was my not even my freshman year. I didn't start attending the church until February of my freshman year. So it wasn't until my sophomore year I had to go to my professors and talk about being gone for the feast. And I realized now, I should have been talking to the teens, man. They've been doing this for years. They know what they're doing, and it's new and it's awkward, but thankfully at least you're a little older. I had one guy that was so excited. One of my professors was like, "Oh, that's great. Are you gonna build a booth? Where are you going?" I was going to Corpus Christi. "Oh, you ought to build a booth. You ought to build a booth on the beach. Can you stay on the beach? I think that'd be great." That sounds terrible to me, but he was also one of those that was kind of a mentor. He was like a part of a mentor program. He was very pro students. Had another guy essentially explain, "Well, I'm sorry, you're gonna get zeros, for everything." So you get that commit. Well, today we're kind of focused on questions that you might receive. We're not going to have a whole variety of questions. Then we're going to focus more on how to answer, things that you can say, and just some advice about answering those kinds of questions, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. the main thing I want to get across the very beginning in terms of how to answer is don't make more of it than it needs to be. Like, for instance, don't assume the person is your enemy or is out to get you or is out to trap you. I try to take, and I can slip out of it sometimes, and I try not to, but I try to take what I call a happy warrior mentality. That I'm out here and I'm out to advance, hopefully, the gospel and by my actions, and in particular, even in my job, I'm blessed to be able to do that. But I'm not here as an angry warrior. I'm here as a happy warrior. And the fact even when I was out before this was my actual job, when someone asked about my faith, I try to see that it can be awkward, especially when you're young. But at the same time, I try to see that as an opportunity. Try to see that as well. This is kind of why I'm different, is so that people will notice. So Christ talks about being a light. He does. I don't put you under a bushel. I set you on a hill. I want people to have the chance to actually see.
And that's hard to embrace too when you're young, like that at first. I don't know. Maybe it varies. I think maybe some kids would be like, but I will freely admit I just wanted to fit in as much as I could and not be different.
Yes, of course we do. By the way, with that in mind, I'd like to recommend Mr. Robinson's article on normal. That even Mr. Weston mentioned just this past family weekend that we had. But we actually could have talked about the Charlotte family weekend. It went very well. But Mr. Weston in a sermon mentioned Mr. Robinson's article about, essentially, why aren't we, your daughter asking, why aren't we normal? And it's such a good article. So I want to take a note right now so I don't forget to put it up. But that said, when you start to really think about it, that's, God, our way should stand out a little bit, right? And those are opportunities. Well, let me talk about two examples. One of which is not me and not even our religion, but I can speak about it positively in terms of what it meant to me. When I was in fifth grade, I'm almost certain it was fifth grade. There was a young lady there, my age, so I would have been 10. Fifth grade is about 10 or 11, and she did not keep Christmas. I did. In fact, the entire rest of the class did, but she did not. She was a Jehovah's Witness. She was not a part of the Church of God. She was a Jehovah's Witness. They don't even keep Mother's Day, Father's Day, is my understanding. They don't do anything.
They hate the family.
No, they don't. No, they don't. But they just don't understand what we understand, that those are not actually pagan. And the whole day would be devoted. It's elementary school. The whole day is devoted to Christmas activities. You're cutting things out, and you're coloring them, and you're painting them, and it's clear. It was clear to me she was not. I think she was, if I recall, she was present. Maybe she had an alternate activity, something that was different. In fact, we do believe it's okay to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but they don't believe that. So we all stand to say the Pledge of Allegiance, which you did back then. She did not. But I remember even at 10, I'm sure some probably thought she was really strange, what the case is. But at least for me, and that's what I'm trying to encourage you to think about, is not those, but think about the other ones that might be impacted differently. It impressed me. It didn't make me necessarily want to be a part of her religion. I didn't know much about it. But I remember thinking well of her. I remember thinking, well, like, oh, she's doing something else. It didn't actually bother me that she. So I try to think of people more in that direction than the directions where they will be bothered. And I should highlight one of the things that moved me personally as a future first generation Christian forward was my friend in the church and talking about Christmas with her. I remember it was on the phone, back when phones were connected to the walls with cords. I remember talking on the phone.
I miss those days.
And Christmas came up because I attended the Church of Christ, and Church of Christ don't all do exactly the same thing. They're kind of from a similar tradition, but they're not all exactly the same.
So from the outside looking in, I felt like Church of Christ took anything that was fun in Christianity and removed it.
Well, there's a bit of that. There's no instrumental music, for instance. A girl I knew in a different Church of Christ, they would wear, they felt that pants that were in the shape of, like, you just put both legs in, were of clothes of a man. So they would wear skirts or culottes. And everyone knows what a culotte is. It looks like a dress, but it's actually got legs. But no, ours was actually pretty close to normal, quote unquote. For instance, I kept Christmas, but they didn't keep it as a religious holiday. That is, a lot of people in the church, I think everybody in that congregation, They probably had a Christmas tree at home, did the presents, all the things, but didn't believe that Christmas was Jesus' birthday, and there were no sermons about it in church. So that's how things were for us. In fact, literally the last thing my pastor in that church ever said to me, as I was walking out, never to come back again because I was going to start attending the church, was Merry Christmas. Oh, Merry Christmas, Wally. That was it. And so I always thought that was interesting. But that said, I was talking with my friend on the phone and I knew she didn't keep Christmas. And I was saying, oh yeah, we don't keep Christmas either. I mean, we keep it, but it's not a really, and she said, well, actually it's, we don't even do what you're talking about. The Bible, says not to do those things. And I think she mentioned Jeremiah 10, and it just really took me back. It's like, wow, really? That caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting that, but it wasn't a how do I put it? It wasn't an adversarial conversation. It was just a conversation. And when I didn't press further at the time that I recall. I could be wrong. Maybe one day she'll be able to tell me. And it's not like she kept hammering away at it, but it was interesting. It was just enough. And so I just want to highlight that you never know what could come from those kind of conversations. It is a way to stand out, but it's a matter of have a happy attitude about it. It's don't fret over it. Pray about it. Talk about it. Man, God, I think I'm going to get questions again this year. How do I answer them? But don't over fret about it. In fact, that's what we'll talk about. Let's kind of jump into it. One of the things I would recommend is take the simple approach. Like, I don't know, Mr. Robinson, were you ever asked just by some guy behind the counter, fast food, or some guy in the store, or hey, you doing anything for Christmas?
Yes, all the time.
That's kind of like at camp I used to teach about ritual questions. Come Christmas time, that's a question you could ask anybody, and no one's going to be shocked. Like, how dare you ask me? How dare you ask me?
Well, I had a wide variety of answers over the years.
Okay.
And then mostly I wanted to avoid it. Especially if it was going to be casual. If it's a person behind the counter, all the more they were saying, oh, hey, are you ready for Christmas? And I'd be like, yeah. I mean, it's coming whether I like it or not. And so I don't know, maybe you could say that's like slightly deceptive. I suppose that they could be taken that way. But I felt like in general, the casual encounters at stores in particular, maybe even restaurants, was just kind of what they were doing all day, and they're just trying to be friendly. And that is not a time to like really engage, in my opinion.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was hoping we'd get across. Because my standard answer generally, if someone says, "Oh, you doing anything special for Christmas?" is just not really.
Not really. Yeah.
I would. Just not really.
You're right. Depending on how they phrase it, you're right. I would say something like that as well.
Yeah, because it's not like they're really, hey, I'd like to engage with this individual in a deep and profound theological discussion about matters biblical. They're just making conversation,
yes.
And you actually have an easy answer for that, which is, no, not really doing anything.
Well, I mentioned this last time we had a podcast where we focused on how to handle Christmas, and when people were being nice, I never wanted to make them feel bad for it, and so I never was critical of it. Even in short conversations where we get a little more in depth, like sometimes people would say, they would ask a question, like maybe you were going to be there a little bit, like maybe a doctor's visit or something where you're going to be there for a little bit, and the way they ask, you realize I can't get away with, oh yeah, some kind of answer to just put them off the trail. And I found most of the time when I would just say, well, actually we don't observe Christmas. And a lot of times that was the end of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they were kind of curious and would say, oh, really? So, what? And they would ask me a little more of why. And they were curious more often than not. But the one thing I was always very careful to do was I was not aggressive. I did not challenge them or their beliefs. Now, there probably is a time and place to do that. There is answer a fool in this folly and don't answer a fool in this folly.
An old podcast on that.
So there are circumstances. But in general, and sometimes I was surprised some of the answers would be, yeah, I've learned or found that some of it they didn't always say pagan, but they were aware that it was not all as Christian as it seems to be.
Right.
But so often, and this is arguably more disappointing, yeah, there, especially somebody who loved it and was more defensive of it. Yeah, there were all these pagan things, but but now it's in Christ. Like Christ has conquered it, kind of idea, and so now it's okay. And so then, how much do you want to continue your conversation.
You want to go into it, right? I think that's a great response. I've definitely given that one too, where it seems like the just super quick short answer is like a little more is needed. And I've said that. I've said I often, instead of, and it took me a while to adapt to this, but I try to do this now. If I'm going to say that, instead of just saying I don't really observe Christmas. I thought after a while that, well, I don't want them to think I'm pro-atheist or like, oh, I don't, religion, God, is all dumb. So I'll preface it a little bit and often say, well, I am a Christian, but I don't observe Christmas.
Yeah.
And I'll actually say at the very beginning that I'm a Christian, which we should be willing to do. It's easy to think Christian is a dirty word. It's not. Regrettably, it's the world, kind of like your article about being normal. It's the world that misappropriates the word Christian. Actually, we own that. That does belong to us. But I kind of like to say that because when it's still a simple answer, but also you never know if that's kind of it could be it plants a seed. It's like, oh, you're a Christian, but you don't keep Christmas. Who knows? Maybe they'll think about that. But for some, they're not surprised. I mean, they've either met Jehovah's Witnesses that consider themselves Christian, or they recognize like, oh yeah, I know there's some people that don't.
It does feel like when I was growing up, there was a lot more. The attitude was almost everybody kept Christmas, but now these days, there's a lot of people that either don't for, well, the reasons you just suggested. I won't rehash them. There's much more understanding that not everybody keeps Christmas now. Plus kind of the war on, I mean, we could talk about that, the war on Merry Christmas, and that's offensive to people. And so you have to say Happy Holidays, although that's kind of, I think, lost a little. Like, it still occurs, but people are kind of tired of that. And a lot of people are back to really pushing Merry Christmas again. Right. And
yeah, it does seem like there's kind of a bit of a backlash growing. In fact, behold a white horse. We know that eventually the one that reigning all over the world is going to make, say, Christmas far more popular, than it maybe ever has been, for centuries at least, in terms of the false religion coming upon the world. Yeah, I actually would say that I think it's becoming more recognized because one, I think for two different reasons. I see more and more articles because you have, say, more atheist types who actually like taking digs at Christianity, writing articles for the New York Times, like, well, Happy Pagan Christmas or something like that. And so as a result, it's becoming part of the popular consciousness even more than normal. But I also think it's evidence that it's doing so because I'm seeing more pushback. I've seen from multiple sources, including a source on YouTube. I think we mentioned him before, but a Catholic podcaster who tries to take apart Mr. Rod McNair's telecast on Christmas. And I'm seeing more pushback from various quote-unquote Christian sources pushing back on the idea that Christmas is pagan, defending Christmas from their perspective.
I just saw one, and it's a very new one, and it was entitled, Why is Christmas on December 25th? And I was very interested to hear the answer. And so it's only a 5 or 6 minute video, not a Catholic. And he comes on and he says, there's a lot of people wondering why Christmas is on December 25th. And, some people say it's the winter solstice festival, Saturnalia, the Sol Invictus and all this whole thing. He said, but about the 2 minute mark, he goes, but the truth is there's really very little evidence that Christmas is founded on paganism. And I was like, you're gaslighting me right to my face. There's actually a lot of evidence that Christmas has pagan background.
And we might even get to some of that in the next question, because I think that you might think, okay, fine, so you're just telling me to give a simple answer, but what if it gets not simple?
Well, but I don't know if this is exactly like this idea is embedded in what you were saying, but I feel that not only Christmas, but a lot of things are actually going to swing way the other way, and it's going to be weird that you don't keep Christmas again.
I do, actually. I think that there's almost a certain normalcy only because of the ascendancy of secularism in our society today. But especially if there is, say, a resurgence of mainstream Christianity, even a Catholic kind of Christianity, if that grows, like on Twitter, I'm seeing a lot of people upset about a Babylon Bee joke about Mary. It was relatively inoffensive. But people saying, "Oh, that's the mother of our Lord," and people kind of jumping in when really, I don't see them get that offended when there's Babylon Bee jokes involving Jesus or anybody else. But this one they happen to jump out at, maybe because they published it on Christmas. But we do know the world is eventually going to swing passionately in favor of a false Christianity, and if anything, yeah, we're going to be sticking out far more, at those times as people rediscovered it. But to wrap up this first part, don't, Mr. Ames used to say, don't overlook the obvious. Sometimes the most obvious thing to do is just give a quick, simple answer. If someone says Merry Christmas, you don't have to say, no, I refuse. Just, you could even, like the penguins say, the old animated penguins, the cartoons, smile and wave, boys, smile and wave. So, you can smile and wave. Even if you say thanks, don't think you've destroyed the world. They're trying to be nice. That's really all it is. However, sometimes it does get a little more questions. Like sometimes your answer does prompt why don't you keep Christmas? And so, well, what do you do? Do you get your Bible out? Do you sit and you got to go into detail? Again, it's try to judge based on the circumstance.
Yes.
And just let your gut inform you a little bit.
I think the circumstances are pretty key.
Yes, because sometimes it's just they're just curious. That's all it is. They're just curious. Other times they might be a little bit offended, like, well, hey, wait, well, why don't you? Maybe they've thought of you as a Christian person, and they're a Christian person, and now suddenly there's something you don't do that they do, and they might feel judged. But a lot of times they're just curious, and if they just get a simple answer, their curiosity is satisfied. They might, it's actually kind of interesting. So yeah, definitely judging the circumstance. And it feels bad telling you, well, you got to play it by ear right there. But honestly, welcome to life, kids. Yeah. Life is always about kind of understanding the circumstances you're in.
I mean, I think you could start making broad categories. There's one in its most basic level is just people. It's the time of the season. Not that we have to agree with that, but it's the time of the season, and people are doing well wishing, doing customer service, and right now, I've had people tell me in the non-Christmas times of year, have a blessed day.
Right.
And so, and I think in general with the seasonal greeting, that is not a time to make a point. I'll never forget when we were at a restaurant in between services on unleavened bread, and I wonder if I told this story before.
It sounds vaguely familiar. I'm not sure. Go ahead.
The waitress comes up, and this guy who I never loved. I was much younger, and he was older. We went out. Our family went out to eat with his family, and he was older. And he said, "Oh, here, we won't be needing these." And like hands the bread rolls to her or something like that.
Made a big show of it.
A big show of it. And then she said, "So okay, well, no problem." And then he says, "Do you know why we don't?" And he wants to go and start explaining to her house the days of unleavened bread. I don't agree with that. It'd be one thing if she was super. Why are you guys all dressed up? And then you say, "Oh, we're going to church today." "Oh, really? What a weird day to have church." "Well, why are you going to church?" And you can tell her, and then like, I've heard of this before. Like if she continues with the conversation in a positive way, then I do think you have an obligation to have some answers.
Absolutely. Right. Be ready to give an answer. Yeah. That's what the Bible says.
But if it becomes argumentative or they become defensive, I would do my best to diffuse the situation.
Yeah. You're not trying to, it's one thing I love about our faith. It was one of the things early on that impressed me about the faith before I was even attending was that they were not trying to shove this down my throat. It's kind of like the old Fox News motto, we report, you decide. It was like, no, we're just here to give witness to the truth. You got to decide what to do with it. They're not trying to shove it on me.
Well, if you take Christmas out of the equation, when you're having a casual conversation with somebody, whether you kind of know them or they're a stranger, and you can tell when people are like, they're not interested in this.
Right.
In general, you can get a feel that, they're actually not that interested. You change the subject. Well, I would apply the Christmas responses to that.
Right. And there's a lot of ways you can respond. So, and that ways that you might discover because think of it just as a conversation. Someone's just talking with you. You might discover in the course of the conversation that they want to know more or that their itch has been scratched and they're done. So someone says, why don't you keep Christmas? One way to answer that, which I think is actually kind of interesting. I'm not saying always do this, but one thing that might come to mind is, I say, "Oh, well, I am a Christian, but I keep the holy days in the Bible instead." Well, that might be enough for some. They realize, he's got different kind of set of days. They know people do different days. Some of these days, some people are even familiar with the idea that there's a Feast of Trumpets or something. Yep. Like 700 Club used to make a big deal about that. But that might be enough for some. It also, it's also kind of more positive. You're not knocking Christmas. You're saying you actually keep a different set of days. It's going to be the rare person who says, oh, well, why can't you do both? That's usually after a longer, that's someone actually is interested and they're kind of diving in. But it's a little more positive, and it just kind of highlights, oh, you do something else, and then you never know. That actually might spur someone to ask, oh, like what holy days do you keep? And for some, they might be like, oh, and so they mentally check off a box. Oh, he's one of those Christians that does something different, you know, and that's kind of all they want to know. At the same time, they might ask more questions like, oh, what are the holy days in the Bible? Then that's, kind of an opportunity.
Well,
to talk
at my
about
old job, it was by far most likely that a coworker or a client would talk about it, and there would be a more in-depth conversation.
Interesting.
Like I think it feels like I told this story before, but I had one of the pressmen who was actually always a bit difficult to work with. But I think in retrospect, he had things going on in his life that was difficult, and so at work he was a bit sour. But he asked me, how do you fast? I'm trying to fast. How do you fast? And like I was like, it's super simple. No, I didn't say that. But in my brain. But then I realized like he didn't understand the concept of fasting. So sometimes fasting, especially if you had a Catholic background where Lent you're supposed to give up something, but my wife had a coworker who said that they were giving up Cokes. And then later in the day, Audrey sees her with a Diet Coke. And she's like, well, it's just diet. It's not a Coke, It's how trivial what we're giving up becomes. And so, so he was very sincere. And I think he was thought, well, maybe he'd skip a meal, something like that. And so I was like, oh, actually, the Bible has it's fairly straightforward on it. And there's, anyway, I felt like I overall gave him a good answer. But like, man, people understand so little at the end of the day.
Yeah, they really do. Part of what I think you've just highlighted, which is kind of neat about moments like this, is even when you're keeping it simple, and maybe they don't ask any of the questions, who knows? Some of you out there might be disappointed. Maybe you're hoping for an extended conversation. But if you remain friendly, you're not confrontational, you just give a simple answer, I think over time it does make it, like at my office where I used to work. I love the people there. It was a great place to work where I used to work as an actuary. And yeah, they just overall pick up. You don't come to the Christmas luncheon. You just explain simple. It's like, oh yeah, we don't keep Christmas. But they start to. It seemed like they start to recognize, well, you read the Bible more. They start to connect you as someone who takes your faith seriously. But then I found over time, some, like if they had a Bible question, something about their church or some question about, well, hey, I know Wally doesn't do that. And they would come, and you could tell it was sincere questions. They actually wanted to, hey, why don't say, or why does this or why does that? And that if you keep things simple, you're not out to start a fight. You're not out. You're just simply asking a question from your heart, just being sincere and simple. I think think of it as playing the long game in that kind of way. You're being an ambassador for Christ doesn't mean a bunch of gigantic moments where you're refusing to bow to an idol and being thrown into fire. Sometimes it's just asking a simple question.
Totally agree. And I try to avoid those situations if I can. The
big thrown
giant
into fire.
idol where the stakes are life and death.
That's where you're going.
Bird.
That's right.
But if I may add on to what you're saying, because you implied this early on in this discussion, which is the importance of your example. Because if you kind of make a show that, well, I don't keep Christmas, but then in every other way you behave like everybody else, like you're not careful with your language. Because, if you work at a printing company, it's like working on a sailing vessel. I mean,
is it really?
A lot of language, and people notice when you don't use the words and all these little things. So it's a whole package of behavior, and people. It's not merely that you don't keep Christmas in some cases, although that is certainly notable. But it's like the whole thing. You're a little calmer than everybody else. You don't use foul language. You're not a hypocrite. That's the biggest one. Man, I think those who are kind of Christian curious are by far put off the most by actual quote-unquote Christians, mainstream Christians, because their behavior often ends up being just pure hypocrisy. I mean, they tout this really religious what is
facade
it?
Kind of
facade. No, facade's
outward
pretty
picture.
good. I was going to say where you're saying the words. What's that? It'll come to me. And But in every other way, your behavior is no different than anybody else's.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I mentioned this before. There was a guy, this is quite a while ago, in one of my print shops who really played up how religious he was, and then later to find out that he was having an affair with a married woman. And nothing crushes your Christian credibility like behaving in that manner.
It's funny you say that, and I'm so glad you did, because it is going to be a critical point in that if you really think about it, these moments when someone asks you about Christmas they're not the deal break. They're not the crucial moments. It's all the moments up till then where now they're asking you, what example have you been up to that point? I remember at work something very similar. I would actually say I did work in a professional environment where language was not, say foul language, was not the norm. It would come out every once in a while because our culture is coarsening, but people tried to be a certain kind of professional. But I do remember being in a room where, and I may have told the story before, but where the fellows, me, two ladies, this other guy, and he's not really nice guy, but sure enough, as he's making a comment, he says this foul word, and then he says, sorry, Wally, and he keeps going, and even in my mind, I'm thinking, there's ladies present. Why you're apologizing to me? What the ladies? But I thought, well, why? Because and they were wonderful ladies, actually, good friends. I appreciate them. But because I was the guy he recognized was religious. But it's not like I went around wagging a finger and saying, oh, that's a naughty word. That's a no word. You shouldn't say that. But you're right, Mr. Robinson. That really does stand out. And so think of that also. In a sense, you've invested in answering this question, not as the season is the other 11 months of the year in the life that you've been living. And that's the context in which they're going to hear your answers, is that. And if you've been a decent person, if you've tried not to be a hypocrite and actually, do your best to be a nice person, then it's going to come across generally pleasantly. It does make a difference. Sometimes people want to make a stink, and that's that, but that's generally not what's going to happen.
Well, he's kind of a weirdo and doesn't keep Christmas, but otherwise, a real nice guy. You can trust him, and he's a hard worker, and he's nice to people. And
yep, exactly right. And there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes people do ask a little more detail, like, why don't you keep Christmas again? And there are other answers you can give more detail. You can say,
so you're saying so in a situation where there's no two ways around it, somebody's pressing you, which does happen sometimes, and they want an explanation why you think Christmas is a problem. Where do you go?
I've personally found I can keep it simple. I think there's some key places to go. Like, well, let me start with the one that my friend used on me, and that was when I was explaining how it's like, oh yeah, we don't really do Christmas like a religious holiday either. We just do it, we do the tree and stuff. And she brought out Jeremiah 10, and credit to her, she was not super into the Bible, as I come to find out. She was not one of those who was just really kind of hardcore Bible studying like you should, but yet she had Jeremiah 10 in her pocket, and she goes, well, she goes, we don't even do those things. She goes, if you look at Jeremiah 10, you wouldn't, it's kind of anti-Christmas tree. Now, some people, I don't know if everyone's ever pushed back on you about Jeremiah 10. If you read the passage in Jeremiah 10, our friends out there in podcast land, go read it. Don't just sit here. But it's a really nice passage. It starts off with, don't learn the way of the heathen, which is literally what we've done with Christmas. We've tried to learn all the different ways of the heathens, and we kind of packed them into a holiday. But then it does describe going out, cutting a tree, bringing it up, propping it up so it stands up, decorating it with silver and gold, and God condemns that. But have you ever brought it up in conversation or had it pushed back on you, Mr. Robinson?
I think one time I had somebody try to explain to me that it is not describing a Christmas tree there, right, even though it feels a little on the nose to me. But that was it. Just that it was like, oh, you're making too much out of that, and it's describing something else that's not a Christmas tree.
Yeah, see, they do that, and I would say, well, just be prepared for that, because like there's a passage in the New King James. It says like the workman, the work of the workman with the axe. And they would say, well, it's not just describing chopping it down. It's describing as shaping it into an idol, and not just throwing tinsel on it. It's about putting gold plating on it and stuff, and shaping more of a traditional idol, which I would say a few different things. But among the things I could say is that, well, one, just if you read it on the surface, it definitely sounds Christmas tree-like. Like you said, it's kind of a little on the nose. But here's the thing. Am I supposed to be okay with something because it's idol-like? light, it's like, oh, you're right. They didn't actually literally carve a face into it, so I guess I'm okay with that. The fact is, the Christmas tree is, yes, it's been enhanced by quote unquote Christians, Protestants, and others. I think someone said Martin Luther came up with adding candles or something, for lights to symbolize things. But still, you go back to the old Yule traditions. They do not originate in Christianity. They are very close to what's described in Jeremiah 10. It reminds me of when some say, like, we'll say that the Catholic practice of using so many statues of their saints and putting candles in those places and praying before statues. I saw a Twitter pushback. We'll say that's a part of idolatry. And I do see a lot of Catholics on Twitter. I'm not sure if I'm being fed the Catholics or, they're growing. But so the one was pushing back on the idea that, well, it's nothing but rank idolism to kneel before an object and express such emotion. And he goes, oh, really? And then he posted a picture of like some veteran at the Veterans Wall who's in Washington, D.C., who's just sad. His comrade's name is there. Well, it's like, okay, yeah, that is like exactly the same thing. It's not the same thing. They'll explain away, well, no, I'm not worshiping this, I'm worshiping God. I'm praying to God, or I'm asking this departed person who is now in heaven, they believe, to, don't you think they're still alive? If they're alive, why can't I ask, them to do something or to help in some way? We ask each other for prayer. They would say, why can't I stand before this statue of Saint so-and-so and ask him for prayer just because he's in heaven? Well, ignoring the whole immortal soul thing, I kind of want to use the same principle that I use with my the kids in the year 2 living education class when it comes to evaluating things about evolution. There's something called the duck principle, that if it looks like a duck and it sounds like a duck and it walks like a duck, it's probably a duck. And you can get so many abstractions trying to excuse a certain behavior from not fitting the condemnation in the Bible, when really you have to just go back and ask yourself, would any first century Christian not see this as anything but idolatry?
Yeah.
You've got all of these statues and all of these objects. It would clearly be idolatry to them. You're just layering on all these excuses, and the Christmas tree gets to be the same way. Would anyone see Jeremiah 10 and say, okay, maybe you don't carve a face in it, maybe you haven't done this? It fits in all these other details. So let's say someone, no, I made an idol, but I didn't use gold and silver. I used titanium, and I used this. Does that make it not an idol? No, you are partaking in an idolatrous practice.
Yeah. People underestimate what true idolatry is in its vast scope. And as not Ezekiel, maybe you can scripture check me on this, but as God says, it is written, idolatry begins in the heart. It's the things that we covet. I use as an example in a sermon I did, like if the closest I would come to just like, well, this is idolatry, even though I didn't recognize it as such, as in my high school years, my teen years, played a lot of basketball, and the big time transcendent player was Michael Jordan. Nike even had an ad campaign for him that said, "Be like Mike," and so be like Mike, get his tennis shoes, get all these different things. I patterned how I played basketball after how Michael Jordan. The only thing I was missing was elite athleticism. But anyway, and so think about what you do with a Christmas tree. Like, you go out and you carefully select it, and you place it somewhere in your home that's like the most visible. Mm-hmm. I'm intrigued by how many people put it somewhere in a window so you can see it outside the house.
Oh yeah,
decorate it. Put the gifts under it. So many of the things you do in celebration of Christmas is around this object. And you're right that it seems to be, it not having a face seems to be the key, because otherwise in every way you've treated it and venerated it as if it was an idol.
Right.
If it was a statue of Mary and you did all those same things, it would be idolatry. But again, not having the face seems to be people like, oh, whatever, it's just a pretty tree, it's just decorative. No.
Right.
You've organized everything going on in your house for 6 weeks around this thing.
That's right. Fire hazard. 100%. So it's like, if someone wants to argue that, it's like, I don't need to argue. It's like, hey, I get it. You want to keep doing what you're doing. It's like I'm just going to do this. You don't have to get into a fight. By the way, the verse you wanted to know, Ezekiel 14 verse 7.
It was Ezekiel. Okay.
You were good job, Mr. Robinson.
Yeah, thank you.
It says, for anyone of the house of Israel or of the strangers who dwell in Israel who separates himself from me and sets up his idols in his heart. That really is the place where you set them up. That's forget the pedestals or something. That's where they start. They start being set up in your heart.
That adds another irony to it, which is, Christmas is supposed to be this great celebration of Christ and his birthday, and then other elements of Christ kind of work their way into it. God says right there, it actually separates you from him. The idols separate you from him. So again, ironically, Christmas would be the opposite of what people think they're doing by keeping Christmas.
Exactly. I found, to give you this and to keep it simple, if you just, one, do your homework. This is your faith. Study why you don't do those things. Get our booklet on Christmas. Actually read the booklet that Mr. Wakefield wrote about Christmas. But I find keeping it simple is the best thing to do. And when it comes to verses, I keep that simple too. If for some reason someone really wanted to know biblically, like, well, what are the Bible reasons you don't keep Christmas? I mean, if they really got down to it, I wouldn't get complicated. I wouldn't even necessarily go to Jeremiah 10. I mean, if I'm having a conversation with someone, I might, if it's an extended conversation. But if they really said, hey, well, why in the Bible, why would you think Jesus doesn't want you to keep Christmas? What's it say in the Bible? I have two go-to places, Mr. Robinson, and that's Mark 7, Deuteronomy 12. Yep. I go to Mark 7 first because I like Mark 7 first because it's about Jesus. That is, we're not trying to be Jewish. This is Jesus' own teaching. And in Mark chapter 7 is where he's talking to the Pharisees, and he says how these people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And he says, you set aside God's commandment for the sake of your tradition. And so I can tell him, it's like, so I got a choice. There's a Christmas tradition. I could keep it, but is it setting aside any commands of God to do so? And it is, because Deuteronomy 12 tells us not to worship God in the ways of the people. And so you've got to set aside Deuteronomy 12 to keep a Christmas tradition. And I want to obey Jesus, so I'm not going to do that.
I check this now when I read the New Testament as more of a habit, but it looks like he's quoting there, at least in part, Isaiah 29.
Yeah,
you would never get into this level of detail probably with having a discussion with somebody about this whole topic. But man, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is filled with the concept that God lays out very specifically how you should worship him, and any other thing you try to work into that is a problem.
Right. He really wants you to worship him the way he tells you to worship him. Do that.
He warned the ancient Israel when they took possession of the land not to take what those guys were doing and incorporate it into the worship of me, and of course they did.
And those who want to argue all the technical things about, like, maybe Sol Invictus came later, all the things they want to bring up. The fact is, if you go into your standard, at least American home, and you see a Christmas tree there and the accoutrements, the idea that those were not borrowed from paganism is completely baseless. You've got to do some real contortions to pretend that.
I might suggest one other thing here as I feel like we're wrapping up. Of course, that means we're going to go another 20 minutes.
No, we're not.
We're not. I find you can also sort of put it back on them. Like I do, I totally agree. If you're growing up in the church and especially as you're becoming an adult, and God will expect more out of you as you get older and older, and so you have to be able to stand up for your beliefs, that you should know, like Jeremiah 10, for example, and these other ones Mr. Smith has suggested. But you can also take an angle of, hey, listen, I just try to follow the observation God spells out in the Bible, and I can't find anything about Christmas. It's not, like, you can put it back on them to explain why they keep Christmas when I can't find any mention of that in the Bible.
Right.
So that's just another way you could potentially.
Oh, that's a great example. And they might say, well, I think the wise men. A lot of times they don't know. They say, I think the wise men are in there, and they say those things, and then you kind of say, well, yeah, that was. But it is not talking about keeping Christmas. Those things are just brought in. I think it's a great example. We don't always have to be on the defensive. We can always kind of ask someone, put a question to them. So, in short, how can we summarize this, Mr. Robinson? Keep it simple. Don't stress out.
Yeah.
Keep it simple.
And I think some element of it is an answer that nobody really likes, which is depends on the situation. You have to make a judgment call.
Yeah, you might think it's really difficult. I want to know how all the experienced people answer this question. Well, guess how they did? By gaining the experience that you're getting the opportunity to do.
I did get to the point where I felt like, especially by my 20s, I can't dodge this. I should have some kind of answer. There's a variety of ways you can handle it. I think I said this last time we talked about this. Don't lie, which is very tempting to do, where you kind of weasel your way out of it by not really answering or leaving them, and you've left them with a belief that's not actually true, like by either leaving a data point out or something like that. And man, there's just a point where you just got to take it head on. And I know it's not fun. Most people avoid conflict. It's going to be tough having a good answer for why you believe the things you do, especially when we're so out of step with the world. We're in step with God, which is the most important thing. But it's a tough thing to tackle, but it gets easier the more you practice it.
It does. And be willing to embrace it, because in a very real way, that's part of why you're here.
Smith and Robinson.